Well, hi, welcome. I'm Chris. I'm the pastor at Compass. I'm really glad that you're with me today because this is the final week of our message series, Past is Prologue. Now, Shakespeare actually coined that phrase in his play, The Tempest. He said, "What's past is prologue." And it basically means that everything in our history creates the context for what's happening now. That the prior events of our lives set the stage for what comes next. It's actually one of a lot of cool statements about the past. Confucius said, study the past if you would define the future. He meant that creating a good future means learning the lessons of the past. George Santayana, he said this. He said, those who do not remember the past are condemned to repeat it. And that means that if you don't remember and learn from the past, you're doomed to repeat it over and over again. You're doomed to repeat its mistakes, and you're going to see the same results. Arnold Schwarzenegger said, I'll be back, meaning that his Terminator, who had come from the future to protect John Connor in the past, would return to defeat the other Terminator, who had also come from the future to kill John Connor. It's a complex time travel story from the 80s, and it crosses multiple movies, but it teaches us that what happens in the past has implications for the future. There's actually another time travel movie that I recently discovered, and it's called Assassins 33 AD. Now, it's the story of these terrorists who go back in time to kill Jesus and end Christianity, and the group of scientists who go back in time to stop them. Basically, it's the plot of Terminator, but it meets the New Testament. And this movie is bonkers. There's a scene where a bunch of military guys in all their black combat gear with night vision goggles, go back in time, bust into the Garden of Gethsemane when Judas is betraying Jesus, and just start shooting everybody who's in a robe with their automatic rifles. It is crazy. But at its heart, Assassins 33 AD is a movie about a group of people who are trying to save Jesus from terrorists. Honestly, I can't imagine anything more American than that. But in this series, we've been looking at the final day of Jesus' life, and today, almost as if we were in the movie Assassins 33 AD ourselves, we find ourselves in the Garden of Gethsemane when Judas betrays Jesus with a group of people who think they need to save him. Now let's take a look at this here in Matthew 26, verse 46. It says, even as Jesus said this, Judas, one of the 12 disciples, arrived with a crowd of men armed with swords and clubs. They'd been sent by the leading priests and elders of the people. The traitor Judas had given them a prearranged signal. You will know which one to arrest when I greet him with a kiss. So Judas came straight to Jesus. Greetings, Rabbi, he exclaimed, and he gave him the kiss. Now, here we are at the Garden of Gethsemane. This is happening after the Last Supper, and we find Judas bringing a mob of men to arrest Jesus late at night. Now, it would have been really dark, and all of the guys in this mob, they may not have known what Jesus looked like, and so they needed a way to identify him here in the darkness. Now, if they showed up to arrest Jesus at night without knowing where he was or which guy he was, Jesus might escape, and so they had to do this quickly, and they had to get it right the first time. So to identify Jesus, they sent Judas in all by himself to find him and kiss him on the cheek. And then after that, Judas could slip away before the soldiers busted in, and Judas could then act as surprised as everyone else when it happened, and no one would know that he was the betrayer. See, this whole kiss thing, it wasn't some sort of emotional betrayal. It was really just logistics. But the story continues here in verse 50. Jesus said, my friend, go ahead and do what you've come for. Then the others grabbed Jesus and arrested him. But one of the men with Jesus pulled out his sword, and he struck the high priest's slave, slashing off his ear. Now, after identifying Jesus, a mob with swords and clubs rushed into the quiet Garden of Gethsemane to arrest Jesus. One of the disciples, who we're actually going to find out from John's gospel, is Peter. He pulls out a sword and he just starts swinging it to defend Jesus and save him from this mob, chopping a guy's ear off in the process. And why not? Someone had to save Jesus. And what is a guy's ear compared to protecting the Lord? Our story continues in Matthew 26:52. Put away your sword, Jesus told him. Those who use the sword will die by the sword. Don't you realize that I could ask my Father for thousands of angels to protect us and he would send them instantly? But if I did, how would the scriptures be fulfilled that describe what must happen now? And then Jesus said to the crowd, am I some dangerous revolutionary that you come with swords and clubs to arrest me? Why didn't you arrest me in the temple? I was there teaching every day. But this is all happening to fulfill the words of the prophets as recorded in the scriptures. At that point, all the disciples deserted him and fled. There's a lot happening here, and I want to draw out just a few things that Jesus said and did. I think they're worth looking at. And the first one is this, that Jesus said violence destroys those who use it. This probably comes as no surprise coming from Jesus, but it is complicated. We live in a broken world full of broken people who do terrible things to each other. And from a practical perspective, it's really the judicious use of violence that keeps people safe. Police can only protect people because they carry with them the threat of state-sanctioned violence against criminal offenders. Police don't carry guns because they look cool. They carry them because they communicate something and they may need to use them. The military is the same. The threat of military violence, it can serve both as a deterrent and protection from our enemies. Its use, particularly by nations and governments, it's complicated. So, just for the sake of argument today, let's ignore the usefulness of violence in society and let's just look at it on an individual level. Because when we do that, Jesus makes it clear that he doesn't roll that way. That violence not only destroys those who use it, but it is not the way of his kingdom. It's certainly not something his followers should use to advance their own ends and values. And yet, there's a survey done in 2023. It showed some surprising trends as it relates to violence, specifically political violence. The survey found that 23% of Americans support political violence if the country is going in a direction that they don't like. 79 million Americans think political violence is okay. Oh, wait, hold on. I actually misspoke. That's the percentage of non-Christian and religiously unaffiliated people. Do you want to know the percentage of white evangelical Christians who think political violence is okay? It's not 23%. It's 31%. 106 million white evangelicals think it's okay to use violence when they think the country's going in the wrong direction. That is a lot of professed Christians who would say that Peter did the right thing when he tried to defend Jesus. But Jesus would disagree. Because no matter what values and goals they're trying to advance, violence destroys those who use it, even if it's done in God's name. Let's go back to look at something Jesus said in Matthew 26:53 as we continue. Jesus said, "Don't you realize that I could ask my Father for thousands of angels to protect us, and he would send them instantly?" One reason Jesus disapproved of violence was that Jesus trusted God's ability to protect him. It's crazy to think that when Jesus was praying that God would let this cup pass from him, that Jesus could have just said, "I'm not doing this." And he could have called down an army of angels, but he didn't. Instead, he trusted his Father to take care of him. Jesus understood that through God, there was power and protection available to him that made Peter look like a little kid swinging around a plastic sword. And this is kind of a comforting thought, because when we live in a scary world filled with scary people who aren't like us, who don't believe what we believe, and who we think want to hurt us, we don't have to fall back on violence as a defense. We can trust that God can protect us. Jesus knew it, and we can too. But in spite of the fact, God doesn't always protect us from harm. Look at Matthew 26:53. "Don't you realize that I could ask my Father for thousands of angels to protect us, and he would send them instantly?" Continues. "But if I did, how would the scriptures be fulfilled that describe what must happen now?" Jesus could have called down an army of angels, and God would have sent them. But he didn't do that. Because he not only trusted in God's power, he trusted in God's will. Jesus had just spent hours asking God to change his mind. But when God didn't, Jesus accepted it. Because he understood that God's will for him, it included suffering. The path God wanted him to walk was going to take him through the valley of death. And God didn't cause that evil, but he also didn't remove it from Jesus' path. Because sometimes the path God has for us, it will take us through dark valleys. There will be times we feel under attack and hurting, when we don't understand why the world is the way it is and why people are the way they are. That's just being a human being in the world. Suffering is part of the package. But when we entrust ourselves to God's will, he can make something out of it, just like he did with Jesus. He doesn't cause our suffering, but it's his will to always redeem it when it happens. When we put these things all together, we can see what God's will was for Jesus in this moment. His will for Jesus was to follow the path to his death on the cross. His will for Jesus was to trust him, to care for Jesus as he walked that path. And his will for Jesus was to prevent the use of violence in the defense of his cause. God's will was not for Jesus to resist his enemies, but to die for them. Now, I want to bring all of this into our world today. It's very easy for Christians today to react like Peter did when we feel under attack, or when we feel like God is under attack. We can take on a defensive posture, defending him and our Christian values by any means necessary. We pass laws opposing the freedoms of people who don't vote like us, who don't pray like us, and don't believe like us. We ban books. We make schools put the 10 Commandments in every classroom. We legislate against the vices, the lifestyle choices, and the religious practices of people who we think God disapproves of. Because if we don't defend God, who will? At the extreme, we can embrace violence because someone needs to fight for God's values when they're under attack. So we take out our swords and we start hacking away because we love Jesus and someone needs to protect him from our enemies. But that's not Jesus's way. You want to know God's way of fighting our enemies? He says it in Matthew chapter 5, verse 43. You've heard the law that says, love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I say, love your enemies. Pray for those who persecute you. In that way, you will be acting as true children of your Father in heaven. Children of God, we don't assault our enemies. We love them. We lift them up. 1 Peter 3:9 says this, don't repay evil for evil. Don't retaliate with insults when people insult you. Instead, pay them back with a blessing. That's what God has called you to do, and he will grant you his blessing. Retaliation isn't the way of Jesus. Blessing is. Blessing others is. Because at the end of the day, Ephesians 6:12 says this, we are not fighting against flesh and blood enemies. People are not our enemies. And when we start to think they are, we need to remember this. It's what Romans 12:14 through 19 says. Bless those who persecute you. Don't curse them. Pray that God will bless them. Never pay back evil with more evil. Do things in such a way that everyone can see you are honorable. Do all that you can to live in peace with everyone. It's not our job to fight against God's enemies using the tactics of the world. The tactic for followers of Jesus is love. It's doing everything we can to honor others and live at peace with them. And we don't do that through violence, whether it's physical violence, verbal violence, even legislative violence. And we certainly don't do it by oppressing them before they can oppress us, or lashing out because we feel like we're under attack. We don't need to protect Jesus. He doesn't need our protection. And if you take nothing else away from this, take this. Our job is not saving Jesus. It's representing him well. The ends never justify the means. We cannot engage in practices that are counter to his kingdom values in order to advance his kingdom. And our power should never be used to hurt, oppress, or diminish people we see as our enemies. Our power should be used to bless them, to love them. Jesus had the power to call down an army, but he didn't leverage it. He had the power to lead his disciples in a violent revolt, but he refused to. In fact, when one of his disciples was swinging a sword around, thinking it was his duty to defend Jesus, Jesus told him to knock it off. We will never need to go back in time to kill the terrorists who are trying to kill Jesus. Besides, when his disciples try to defend him from his enemies, it usually does a lot of damage on both sides. The irony is that trying to save Jesus, it may be the first step we take in denying him. was for Peter. But rather than kill his enemies, Jesus chose to die for them. He didn't need a sword. The cross is the only weapon Jesus uses against the enemy of God because he loves them. He blesses them. So if you think you need to defend and protect Jesus, put your sword down. Stop retaliating, paying back evil for evil, and cursing your enemies. Instead, love them. Represent Jesus well by embracing his way of being in the world. Trust that God has the power to fight his own battles. Trust in his will for your life and in our world. Jesus didn't fight with a sword. He fought with a cross. So when you see the enemies of God all around you, put down your sword and take up your cross so that you can live like Jesus lived, think like he thought, and do what he taught. Thanks for joining me. I'll see you next week.